Now, a very warm welcome to this debate on financing long-term resilience at the European Forum for Disaster Risk Reduction 2021. My name is Olaf Bruns. I'm a journalist based here in Brussels with an eye on EU affairs, social policies and sustainability. And it will be my honor and really a pleasure to guide you through this debate today. Now, instead of an introduction, I would like to tell you a short story. Last summer in July, well, the summer of this year, I was on a long tour with my bicycle from Brussels, where I live, eastwards through Belgium into Germany and along the Rhine, the river. And as I work in media normally, I'm following the news all the times, often ad nauseam. So part of the idea of this trip was not to check the news a zillion times per day. In fact, not to check it at all. So for several days, I cycled along the Rhine, which is an incredibly huge river, especially when you're that small on your bicycle. And I wanted to travel back by train. Now, it happened that the day of my return was 16 July. It had rained for days and friends had told me about local floods. In fact, I had cycled quite a bit under the rain, which was not very pleasant always. But as I was not checking the news, I had no idea of the scale of what was going on. So I sat on one of those few cramped trains along the Rhine that did actually function, and I saw the river rising and rising and rising. And it's really a gigantic river in normal times, but now it seemed almost twice that large. And I began to realize that something immense was happening. In Cologne, I had to change trains, but it was difficult to get any train into Belgium because they were disrupted because of the floods. But eventually I managed to start a sort of odyssey of small trains from one small town in Belgium to the other. And from the various trains, I saw the plains and the narrows along the rivers Meuse and Vesdre. And what I saw was a valley of destruction, a valley of devastation. There were houses ripped open by the floods, furniture lying scattered in the streets or drifting in the waters, houses that stood in the water until the first floor. There were cars sprinkled like toys, head down in the field, uprooted trees. There was dead cattle not yet even rotting in the fields. There were people erring around for shelter, not in panic, rather paralyzed in disbelief. And as the houses were often ripped open by the floods, often you could see inside them. And what I saw there was that there had been hardship already before the floods came. You could tell easily from the furniture, from the interior, that these were houses of penniless people. There was no doubt in this disaster, again, misery had piled up onto misery. Now, and of course, I'm telling you this story for two reasons. If it ever was, Europe is certainly no safe haven from climate change anymore. While the floods I just described were raging, other parts of the continent have been suffering record-breaking heat waves, wildfires, droughts. Climate change is here. It is here to stay. Because of the emissions that are already up there, it is to get worse. With disasters like these floods, increasing in frequency, but also in ferocity. And the other reason is it affects the most vulnerable most. Those at the losing end of inequality are hit the hardest, and it leads to even further inequality. And this is true for the floods this summer, for the droughts, but also for the impact of COVID-19, for example, or going back a decade, the impact of the 2008 financial crisis. Now, hence, the world, and Europe specifically, needs to get its act together, really. Now, there is progress in adaptation planning across the EU, but investment in adaptation, and hence in disaster risk reduction, remains very low. And that's what we're here to discuss today. The investment needed to make our societies disaster resilient is enormous. It is likely to run into trillions of euros. That's partly also because there's hardly any return on investment to be expected from DRR. no steady cash stream, few bankable projects, at best a reduction of future costs. But even this, however certain it is difficult to measure. So the question really is, what can be done to direct more funds towards DRR? And to discuss this, we have a keynote speaker, 3 more very distinguished panelists, and one guest who couldn't make it to the session, but who has sent a short recorded speech. And towards the end of the session, we'll take some questions from the audience, of course. So I'm very glad to introduce, as our keynote speaker today, Nelson de Sousa, the Portuguese Minister for Planning, who will kick off this session. And even as we're all connected remotely, it is good to remember that it is actually Portugal hosting this European Forum for Disaster Risk Reduction. So already a heartfelt thank you really to Portugal. And let's get the ball rolling. No, we have more speakers. I promised to introduce everybody before. Véronique Ledieu, the head of Service of Natural Risk of the General Directorate for Risk Prevention in France. And I'm glad to introduce Henk Ovink, the Special Envoy for International Water Affairs of the Netherlands, one of the countries that have been hit by the floods this summer, which I just described. And a very warm welcome also to Alana Simpson, the Regional Coordinator for Disaster Risk Management in Europe and Central Asia at the World Bank. And unfortunately, Dragos Pislaro, a member of the European Parliament, where he is in the Economic Affairs Committee and co-chairs the group on the EU Recovery and Resilience Facility, couldn't make it, but we'll have him shortly in a video statement. But let's get the ball rolling, and I'm particularly delighted to give the floor to Nelson de Sousa, the Portuguese Minister for Planning, for a keynote speech. Minister, the floor is yours.
Muito obrigado, em primeiro lugar, pelo convite que me proporciona a oportunidade de participar neste debate, neste painel. Foi-me pedido para apenas apresentar breves pistas que possam dinamizar o debate de uma forma muito sintética e muito resumida, assim o tentarei fazer. Parece-me que, em primeiro lugar, iria apenas introduzir um tópico genérico de reflexão. Hoje em dia, naturalmente, é corrente, é quase um lugar comum dizermos que nos confrontamos com um contexto de larga incerteza, incerteza quanto ao nosso modo de vida atual e futuro, incerteza quanto ao futuro das nossas economias, das economias das nossas regiões, das nossas empresas, e parece-me oportuno fazer aqui colocar aqui uma questão, que é uma distinção que eu julgo que é importante fazer, que é quando falamos de incerteza, do que é que estamos a falar? Estamos a falar de incerteza ou estamos a falar de risco? São dois conceitos que já há mais de 100 anos Keynes e um outro economista menos conhecido fizeram investigações e produziram distinções que são importantes para podermos desenhar políticas públicas de financiamento para obtermos países, economias, regiões mais resilientes. Estes dois economistas, em 1921, através de duas publicações muito conhecidas, basicamente diziam o seguinte: os riscos são fenómenos futuros que podem ser conhecidos, podem ser seguráveis, podem ser mitigados ou até anulados por prémios de seguros a cobrar ou a pagar. Mas a incerteza, diziam eles, não são passíveis ou não é passível de ser objeto de seguro, porque simplesmente ninguém está disposto a cobrir um risco que não se conhece. E porquê que é importante esta distinção entre risco e incerteza? É importante porque as políticas públicas devem diferenciar estes dois conceitos. De forma a que, para os riscos, têm ao seu dispor parceiros do setor privado, nomeadamente do setor segurador, como seu parceiro e com um poder financeiro que deve ser convocado para este desafio, que é um desafio muito grande de financiamento destes trilhões de euros com que nos confrontamos de necessidades de investimento, e para as incertezas dificilmente nós teremos possibilidade de contar com o contributo do setor privado. Diria até que esta ideia muitas vezes que criamos, que todos os riscos devem e podem ser apenas financiados por fundos públicos ou por ajudas públicas, são neste momento, na prática, negadas face à dimensão e à proporção que os desastres cada vez assumem mais, proporção e até frequência que os desastres assumem. Portanto, a primeira questão que eu queria aqui deixar é a necessidade absoluta de todos sermos convocados para esta tarefa de financiar as necessidades de investimento para combater, para mitigar os efeitos dos riscos que estão e que decorrem da transição climática e das adaptações climáticas. A segunda reflexão que eu queria aqui trazer tem a ver com a própria questão das políticas de financiamento. E também para a necessidade de mobilização de todos para as tarefas que temos pela frente. Naturalmente, quando falo de todos, falo do Estado, falo das empresas e falo dos cidadãos. Todos nós temos de ter uma mobilização clara para esta tarefa. E todos temos de construir um sistema com estímulos claros para que todos possamos ter comportamentos adequados para esta tarefa. Do nosso lado, do meu lado, das políticas públicas, temos de desenhar estímulos claros para a adoção de medidas de prevenção e mitigadoras dos fenómenos antes dos mesmos se verificarem. Sobretudo, no tipo de medidas que nós implementamos a quando da compensação dos danos a quando da produção dos efeitos dos desastres. Se criamos a ideia naqueles que sofrem, se criamos a ideia naqueles que sofrem os danos, que o Estado vai cobrir sempre os danos todos, aí vamos correr o risco de dar o sinal errado, de que não vale a pena investir na justa medida das responsabilidades, mas também das possibilidades de cada um, mas se criamos a ideia de que não vale a pena cada um assumir as suas responsabilidades, porque há de haver sempre um programa público que há de compensar os danos decorrentes. Portanto, também temos nas políticas públicas criar os incentivos certos. E aqui também valeria a pena pensar que os programas de financiamento devem ter um quadro estável e, se possível, durável no tempo. Não vale a pena termos sistematicamente programas de emergência construídos e editados em cima dos danos, dos desastres, porque eles são sempre mal desenhados pela pressão natural de querer resolver aquele problema, daquele desastre, daquele evento. Portanto, é a segunda reflexão. Terceira e última reflexão, para apenas lançar pistas. Partilhamos, aliás, como o moderador já deu uma pista e os documentos também, partilhamos este conceito sistémico de resiliência. Resiliência, de facto, é mais, melhor dizendo, a transição climática é muito mais do que a transição energética. A transição energética é muito mais do que a eletrificação e a descarbonização pura e dura. A transição climática em si deve encerrar ações de biodiversidade, de economia circular, de diminuição de riscos, deve encerrar todas estas dimensões, mas também deve encerrar também uma outra dimensão, que é a dimensão de mitigar os efeitos desta mesma transição climática, que são os efeitos assimétricos que vão se produzir desta acelerada transição que todos nós vamos sentir nas nossas empresas, nos nossos trabalhadores, nas nossas pessoas. Portanto, temos este conceito mais sistémico da resiliência e, como tal, o financiamento deve cobrir todas estas necessidades. E, como tal, questões como, dentro além dos desafios tradicionais dos riscos naturais e das catástrofes, temos naturalmente de incluir questões das alterações climáticas, respostas da proteção civil, certamente, mas também outras vertentes, conforme eu já disse, mas também a questão sempre presente da mitigação e de não deixar ficar ninguém para trás. Temos exemplos de boas práticas nessa matéria, a construção dos programas de recuperação e resiliência na Europa, nomeadamente em Portugal, adotaram esta postura. A recente preocupação, ainda em curso, da criação do pacote Fit to 55 na União Europeia, tem também essa preocupação, ainda que se perceba que a necessidade de financiamento foi, enfim, postergada para um horizonte temporal que não se coaduna com a emergência da atuação mais imediata, mas são questões que temos em cima da mesa. Ficar-me-ia por aqui, porque me foi pedido, de facto, que apenas me limitasse a lançar pistas que pudessem dinamizar o debate. Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much, Minister. And let's take this distinction between risks and uncertainty, and of course its implications with us into this debate. And of course also the question of adaptation versus mitigation. But let's delve further into this first round of opening remarks to see a bit where we stand in terms of financing disaster risk reduction in your respective countries or institutions. Henk Ovik, Special Envoy for International Water Affairs of the Netherlands. I guess not many countries have a Special Envoy for International Water Affairs. So could you give us an idea of what you are busy with? What is your job actually? And also perhaps that's a good example, as I know you have been at COP26. Where did the conference leave us in terms of climate disaster finance, but also, because that's your particular focus, water?
Thanks very much, Olaf. And thanks, Minister, for your opening remarks. We really look forward to the Ocean Conference in Portugal, of course, hopefully later next year, working closely together and mixing water source to sea, oceans, and disaster risk reduction and climate action. Thanks for being such a good partner. Also good to see Veronique and Alana with us. Thanks for joining. What is a water envoy? It's an ambassador for water. When was it installed? In 2015. Why? Because the Dutch cabinet, across the board, development cooperation, infrastructure, environment, economics, and climate, understood then that water is of critical importance for sustainable development and climate action. Ban Ki-moon used to say, water is life, and that is true. If you invest in water, it trickles down across every sustainable development goals with better health, more resiliency, better sustainable business, reduction of disaster risks, reduction of impacts, quality of life, biodiversity, and so forth. Opportunities for women, children, girls, and of course, for the most vulnerable. So investing in water is actually your best bet. Creating awareness around it by research, but also political panels, forging coalitions across public and private sector with financiers is one of my main tasks. The second is when a disaster happens, we try to bring together partners from across the world, institutional, informal, NGO, government, finance, to be on the ground, to not work backwards, but to work forwards. The disaster response is not about building back the past, but learning from the past by building for that future. That's tough, not easy, because when a disaster hits, it is often emergency response, which is of critical importance. But the Band-Aid first step should not be the base for nothing after. It should be the base for a resilient, sustainable, inclusive, and comprehensive approach. And last, to scale and catalyze this, I help develop innovative projects, programs, and partnerships across the world to really look at that future, because the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement tell us to say goodbye to the past and embrace that future. Now, going to your question on COP, water was high on the agenda. We organized the first water pavilion ever, not to bring water people to the COP, but to bring COP people to water, from energy, from disaster risk, from cities, from mitigation, and that worked. With 34 partners, 4 countries, we organized over 100 events where that world got together and understood that with the COVID pandemic, WASH is your first line of defense, but investing in WASH is also mitigating climate risks and mitigating climate change. Nature-based solutions help us recover biodiversity, but also build redundancy and resiliency in our systems for a healthier environment. Focusing on water issues in the context of disasters of critical importance for safeguarding health first, hygiene, but at the same time, building a resilient and redundant system. So water is your best bet, as said. And that is what we brought to COP. Then your last question, how are we doing on disaster risk reduction in the issue of finance and climate? Well, not enough. COP26 showed there is still a big divide between the many partners involved, Global North, Global South, institutional, informal. And all we moved again a step ahead, better on track. It's not to say that we did not achieve anything, Adaptation high on the agenda, doubling of finance, loss and damage not off the agenda, but still not resolved. The whole 100 billion, well, we will get there. So promises still to be followed through, but it's not enough. And to my opinion and my experience at COP is that there was a huge commitment from everyone across every sector, background, country, continent, to ensure that we will not let go, that we will keep holding hands. At the same time, that was not enough to deliver on this massive need the world is actually facing. And in the context of disaster risk and the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, who are hit hardest and first and foremost by these disasters, that is a hard sell. So we have to, up our game, scale up our efforts, scale up our promises, and really bring them to action.
Henk, so much. I take from your first part of the answer the necessity to learn from our experience, to learn for the future, to learn how we build back after a disaster, but also from what you said about COP, how huge the task ahead is still. But Alana Simpson, as a regional coordinator for disaster risk management at the World Bank, for the entire area covered by this conference, as Europe and Central Asia, where do you come in channeling finance towards long-term resilience? What are you busy with, and what are the main obstacles you're facing?
Thank you. And thank you very much for inviting me to this great panel. So often we're asked why the World Bank is involved in disaster risk management. And in particular, it's because we have two goals at the World Bank: shared prosperity and ending extreme poverty. And we know that disasters affect the poorest the most. We know that the poorest are twice as likely to live in a fragile home that can't withstand disasters. They're most likely to lose all of their assets in a disaster. And we know that disasters just create long-term poverty gaps, as well as pushing back development gains. We know that if we could stop disasters today, 26 million people would escape poverty tomorrow. That is a huge amount of people, and that really shows the impacts of disasters on the poorest particularly. So at the World Bank, this is a priority area for us. On average, about $4 billion a year is invested in disaster risk management globally. And of that, 40% is specifically in disaster risk management and response, if you like. The other 60% is in other sectors. It's making schools resilient. It's making sure road and bridges are safe from flood. It's thinking about social protection to full sector issue that needs to cover a lot of different areas. So where am I particularly busy right now? I think we are seeing in this COVID pandemic that disasters didn't stop. And you're seeing compounding impacts with whether it's the earthquakes in Croatia, the floods in Belgium and in other countries, the extreme fires and heat waves. The disasters didn't stop for the pandemic. And so they really compounded upon each other. And we know that as the climate warms, these compounding disasters are just going to get worse. So if we don't take a lot of action now, we're really in trouble into the future. And we really also here in Europe focused on reducing the risk. Europe is a beautiful area with a lot of history, but with that comes a lot of old buildings and aging infrastructure. So we see, I'm sitting here in Romania, 3/4 of the hospitals here were built before the modern building codes, before 1978. 1/4 of the hospitals are over 100 years old. So these are beautiful hospitals in some cases, but do they meet modern needs for a pandemic, for disasters? And we see that across Europe. And so there's a real challenge in Europe with aging infrastructure, and particularly infrastructure that was never designed for the climate norms we have now. So stormwater systems that can't withstand the amount of water coming through in cloud bursts, for example. So that's a real challenge in a lot of countries. So thinking particularly where can we invest to reduce risks from climate and natural disasters, and that when we do try and reduce these risks, we're trying to aim for very integrated, comprehensive solutions. I see too often a very patchwork approach in infrastructure, and maybe a building gets energy efficiency, but it's not structurally strengthened. It doesn't get inclusive access for people with disabilities. Or modernized to meet the needs of a modern education system, for example. So we're really trying to, through the World Bank, really promote integrated solutions. Intervene in a building once for many benefits. I also think in terms of obstacles that we have is disasters really are everybody's business, from the private citizen who needs to be prepared and know what to do in their home and their family and ensure their home, to the civil protection agencies that need to be ready to respond and promote disaster prevention, but then across sectors. The health sector needs to do their part, the transport sector, social protection. And in many of these other sectors, it's very hard to get people to prioritize. There are so many stresses in transport, so many stresses in agriculture. How do you get people focused on disasters? So I think that's a really big challenge, but we do know that it pays off. We did some great work with the European Commission recently, which looked at the economics of prevention and preparedness. And on the downside, it showed that European countries could face between 7 and 17% of GDP loss from earthquakes and floods. So that's a huge amount of impact financially from disasters. And unless the private sector gets engaged and options like insurance are explored, all of that cost sits on the public purse. So there's a need to look at how that risk is shared and transferred. But we also looked at retrospectively a lot of investments that have been made in risk reduction and prevention, and it shows it pays off. It almost in every case was financially beneficial to invest in risk reduction, with generally 2 to 10 times the return on investments for prevention and preparedness activities. So we know it makes financial sense. So I'm going to stop there, but I really welcome this debate and this discussion. I think it's great.
Alana, thank you so much. Well, the daunting figures on disaster and poverty you kicked off with, and a very, very welcome reminder, I guess, on the need for holistic solutions, but also already preemptively a bit on where we are going to in this session, the business case and how to make it actually interesting to invest in disaster risk reduction. So thank you very much for that. Now, Véronique, as a head of the Service of Natural Risks at the French General Directorate for Prevention, you are busy with the Prevention Fund for Major Natural Risks, abbreviated, I'm trying to say it, FPRNM, but which is also called Fonds Barnier Fund. Now, tell us, is this fund called after Michel Barnier, whom everybody interested in European affairs knows as the former head of the EU's Brexit task force? And much more importantly, naturally, how does the fund work?
Yes, thank you, Olaf. Thank you for inviting France and inviting me for this very interesting session. So yes, the Fund for the Prevention of Major Natural Hazards was created under the impulse of the same Michel Barnier you know, while he was Minister of the Environment in France. So this fund acts preventively in the field of natural hazards and has a strong articulation with the question of resilience, which brings us together today. This fund was set up in 1995 with the initial aim to finance the relocation of property owners expropriated because of a disaster risk seriously threatening human lives. Then the scope of the fund was gradually expanded, and it is now the first financing tool for the prevention policy in France. Today, we can distinguish 3 main axes of use of the Barnier Fund. First, amicable acquisitions and expropriations in case of serious danger. Second, actions for vulnerabilities reduction. And third, prevention efforts made by local and regional authorities. So I will just give a few details about these 3 axes. So the first 2 actions target both citizens and small businesses. To start with amicable acquisition and expropriations. The aim is to allow populations residing in a particularly exposed areas, in the sense where there is a risk to their lives, and when no alternative mitigation is possible, to resettle outside of these areas and then ensure the security of all the liberated sites. The risks we are talking about are brutal, dangerous, and unpredictable risks, such as ground movements, avalanches, floods, or marine flooding. The second actions of the Fonds Barnier are measures to reduce vulnerability. So it is the fund acts for individual or company with less than 20 employees, and they can both be assisted in carrying out work to reduce vulnerability on existing assets. For example, the construction of shelter in their town or a dwelling exposed to flooding. Finally, the Barnier Fund may be mobilized for the benefit of local and regional authorities to carry out studies, works, or equipment for prevention or protection against natural hazards. For example, knowledge studies of hazards, vulnerability diagnosis, including seismic buildings, for example. It can also be the creation of the strengthening of containment system or the realization of protection against block falls. Something which is quite important also for us is to everybody to be aware of the risks. So the Barnier Fund is also available for preventive public information actions to develop risk awareness among the general public. There's also a specific featured measures for our overseas territories. As you may know, the French West Indies are particularly vulnerable to seismic risk, of course, but also to tsunami and so on. So in this context, the Barnier Fund helps to finance studies and seismic upgrading for schools, fire and rescue services, crisis management building, and also social housing. This is the way the Fond Barnier works.
Veronique, thank you so much. I just pick one minor aspect you mentioned, which is the preventive public information. I think that is something that is probably very important for everything we'll be debating in the hour that is still to come. So thank you very much. And as I said, there is Dragos Pislaro, who co-chairs the group on the EU Recovery and Resilience Facility at the European Parliament, but he couldn't make it. But here is a short speech he sent us.
Distinguished speakers, dear participants, I am deeply honored to bring you today my contribution at the European Forum for Disaster Risk Reduction. Sometimes it takes a natural disaster to reveal a social disaster, and looking back to our recent past, we regretfully remember hundreds of lives lost during the floods we had this summer in Western Europe, the wildfires in Greece, the earthquakes in Italy, and sadly in the past years, the 70,000 lives lost during the 2003 European heat wave, or the 1,000 lives lost during the 1940 Vrancea earthquake in Romania. But nothing compares to the pandemic that hit our continent 1.5 years ago and which keeps affecting our citizens as we speak. The real disaster is when we lose hope. And this is something that the European Parliament fought hard to keep faith, to keep working to transform this tragic COVID-19 crisis into an opportunity, to find a solution on how to tackle the economic and social consequences of the pandemic, but also to fight inequality, to integrate the green and digital transition successfully in our lives, to provide a bright and prosperous future to our next generations, to consolidate our administrative capacities, and most importantly, to come back stronger, to become more resilient in the long term. Back in May last year, the Commission announced a way to finance resilience, the recovery plan, the Next Generation EU. And with it, the big news that 90% of the Next Generation EU funds will be dedicated to finance the Recovery and Resilience Facility, an enormous instrument dedicated to reforms and investment. The European Commission came with the funding, but the Parliament noticed that the RRF was missing a structure. 672.5 billion euros cannot be left at member states' discretion to be spent as they wish. Otherwise, they will not generate EU value added. They will not foster convergence, and we will not bring the long-term resilience in our economy and society. And this is the main reason for which we created the 6 pillars for reforms and investment. The pillars that are the green transition, the digital transformation, the economy and competitiveness, the social cohesion, the institutional resilience, and measures dedicated for children and youth. All member states were bound to present measures for all the pillars in the recovery and resilience plans. This is our way of ensuring that they address challenges related to all these dimensions in a balanced fashion. As a co-rapporteur on the RRF, on the Recovery and Resilience Facility, when I look back at what we have accomplished in 1 year, I feel proud. Proud that the Parliament stood up to its ambition and glad that the member states managed to draft and submit their plans. Most of them are already approved and started implementation. We really want the RRF to be different from any financial instruments we had before. In order to achieve this, it's still a long road in front of us, one which in the end needs to make us better prepared for the unexpected, needs to make us able to save more lives and to prevent damages caused by shocks. But most importantly, one that will leave us with a safer planet to live in, as the sooner we tackle climate change, less natural disaster will occur and impact us. What must we do? I think that one of the important lessons is that we must blend reforms with investments. The RRF was designed not only to support fiscal sustainability, but also to increase convergence and cohesion. But please bear in mind the fact that in order for the RRF purpose of generating economic and social resilience to be achieved, it needs to generate further investments, private investments, investments through other EU programs, but most importantly, sustain nationally financed investment. If the RRF will not generate this additional investment, it will have only a temporary effect on reducing deficits and debt ratios, but without a positive effect on growth in the medium to long run. We must shape the EU programs into being more inclusive and always incentivizing member states to achieve objectives on both the economic and social dimensions. The RRF structure of 6 pillars is a way forward in a sense, is an example of a broader framework for the EU economic governance that will actually bring a value added to the semester and maybe even change or upgrade the European semester as it is right now. Last but not least, I hope that the member states will use the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction 2015-2030 when implementing measures part of their recovery and resilience plans that tackle risk reduction. It is extremely important if we truly wish to foster resilience of our crisis response, not only to invest in disaster reduction, but also to understand disaster risk, to strengthen disaster risk governance, to manage disaster risk, to enhance disaster preparedness for effective response, and to build back better in recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. These are some of the ideas that I wanted to share with you. I hope that they will provide some food for thought when trying to see how we can achieve recovery and ensure resilience of our Union. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you to the European Parliament, to Dragos Fislaru, who has sent us this video. Now, it really seems that with the European Union's RRF, there is money around. So as probably the Financial Times would coin it, the question is how to spend it. There's also a funny thing, how it often seems that US campaign slogans become EU slogans later. That was certainly true for Hillary Clinton's Stronger Together. That was suddenly all over the place here in Brussels in EU communications. And it seems again with a Build Back Better that Dragos just mentioned, which was also one of Joe Biden's campaign slogans. But the fact is, very rightly, Dragos uses this quote connected to the UN Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, because that is where it was actually coined. So, Minister, what are the disasters Portugal faces? And in the Ministry of Infrastructure, how do you invest in prevention and resilient infrastructure? Or if I may phrase it differently, how do you actually build back better?
Muito obrigado pela questão. De uma forma geral, Portugal não é imune a todas as eventualidades de desastres de diversa natureza. Mas não escondemos que todos os anos temos uma ameaça sempre permanente durante o verão dos incêndios florestais nas zonas rurais. Temos tido eventos dessa natureza. Felizmente que nos últimos anos, portanto desde 2017, temos tido a possibilidade, através de programas de prevenção, através de medidas preventivas, temos conseguido evitar a existência de eventos significativos em termos de incêndios. Mas tivemos em 2017, se bem se lembram, incêndios que conduziram dois deles mortos, infelizmente, e que lamentamos, e que foram de perto de 70 pessoas, 70 portugueses que infelizmente vieram a falecer em consequência desses acidentes. O problema da questão da gestão da floresta é uma questão fundamental para nós. Nós temos a convicção de que apenas com uma gestão florestal global que conseguimos evitar estes desastres. Não é naturalmente através só de medidas muito específicas de natureza florestal, mas é fazendo uma gestão global da floresta e uma gestão preventiva e fazendo um outro uso desta mesma floresta. E que passa, sobretudo, por um outro tipo também da própria ocupação deste território. Naturalmente que isto implica mudanças estruturais, mas que se defrontam com diversas realidades. E as realidades socioeconómicas são as que mais difíceis são de superar. Nós temos um território florestal onde 90% são pequenas e muito pequenas propriedades e que são de propriedade privada. Portanto, temos aqui de ter um incentivo muito grande à concentração e à cooperação para que se juntem, portanto, os produtores florestais, porque sem isso nós não conseguimos dinamizar ações de prevenção, ações de mudança de tipos de árvores e de tipos de florestação menos sujeitas a esse tipo de eventos, nomeadamente a combustível florestal. Portanto, e é nesse campo que nós estamos a trabalhar a médio e longo prazo. No imediato, naturalmente, temos investido em campanhas de sensibilização, em campanhas de organização das populações locais, em campanha também, naturalmente, de melhoria de todos os meios de proteção civil, e isso também é que tem conduzido, digamos, tanto, a que desde 2017, portanto há 4 anos, que Portugal não tem este tipo de situações. Tivemos também, há 2 anos, um evento que afetou muito as nossas ilhas dos Açores, que foi o furacão Lourenço, que destruiu muito das nossas infraestruturas portuárias, particularmente de uma das ilhas, praticamente destruiu o porto de uma ilha, e destruir o porto de uma ilha está isolada no Atlântico, é destruir uma infraestrutura que é fundamental para esse território. Portanto, também se trata aqui, estamos neste momento em processo de reconstrução desse porto, portanto é vital para que ele seja reconstruído no mais curto espaço de tempo. É aquilo que eu posso dizer. Depois temos ameaças de questões naturais. Temos o problema da água. Nós somos um país rodeado de água, mas temos o problema da gestão da água, sobretudo na Zona Sul, problemas já que ameaçam a prazo não muito longínquo questões de seca, portanto, e de seca extrema. A região do Algarve, a nossa região turística, está ameaçada fortemente nessa matéria. Já temos conflitos de utilização da água nesse território e que nós temos encontrado soluções estruturais para isso, que passarão por uma convergência entre ter perfis de menor consumo de água, porque se trata de um bem escasso e que mesmo com soluções de melhor gestão vai continuar a ser um bem escasso. Portanto, é nesse binómio de melhoria da eficiência, mas de um contexto de escassez, de um bem escasso, que estamos a traçar a nossa visão estrutural.
Minister, thank you so very much. You alluded to the huge structural changes that are ahead, and which is, I think, a very topical reminder for the daunting task. But it struck me also how often you mentioned water, and that leads me just naturally, I think, to Henk here in the debate. Henk, if there is one country where DRR has become visible, tangible, in the form of a massive public infrastructure, it's the Netherlands, and I think, of course, of the Delta Works, which is a network of dams, locks, and storm surge barriers to make the tides of the North Sea manageable, and was started to be built in the 1950s after a major flood catastrophe. And if I may, on a personal note, as somebody who is Dutch, half Dutch myself, I can only recommend everybody to go to the southwest of the Netherlands and to have a look yourself. This is truly breathtaking. But in the 1990s, heavy rains have caused similar river floods as the one I described earlier. And the approach that was developed in the aftermath of these floods have also really been a sort of change of tack, like from fending off the water towards working with it. Is that correct? Tell us about the Room for the River project, please.
Thanks very much, Olaf, for your question. And it's true that infrastructure we put in place post 53 is massive, but also progressive, you could say. I'd like to take you back a little longer in the 12th century in the Netherlands, where we started to organize ourselves around water. We look often at the projects, the infrastructure scale, because it's visible. But the invisible, which is the governance, the partnerships, the collaborations that actually drive these projects, are of critical importance. And this is what we see from the 12th century up: a fourth layer of government, the water authority, plus institutional capacity and capacity in our communities to work together to provoke better solutions. And that leads me also to disasters in the 14th, 15th, 16th, but also 20th century, like the one you mentioned. The first barrier that was put in place was a hard barrier in an immediate response to the disaster. The second was already landscaped. And the third is an open barrier. So we also learned the first answer to that disaster was perhaps not the most progressive. The third already was future-oriented, and the latter ones only became more robust, more sustainable, more inclusive, thanks to a societal debate. And I think that is what stands out in what we call disaster response. As I said in my earlier comments, look forward, not back. It's very hard, it's not happening, but this is actually what we learned. And that also brings me to 1993 and 1994 and 1995, where a lot of water came into our rivers. Not on our coast, not with a surge or a storm, but snow melt and rains upstream. Again, that means we have to work across borders and boundaries. You can't fix these challenges alone. You have to take a systems approach from the source to the sea. And in the aftermath of these near disasters, where we had to evacuate 250,000 people in 1995, and also for the Netherlands, that is a big task. We realized that our rivers were not fit for the future. That also came from studies that we already did in the 80s, focusing on our delta, on our riverine system, looking at landscape, agriculture, and urbanization, the mix of challenges and opportunities. And that we understood that if the river needs more room, you should not limit it into barriers, dams, dikes, and levees, but you have to rethink what this river actually was. A living thing, meandering, transporting sedimentation next to goods and people. So if you understand the river and the delta better, the only way forward is to give it back its room and its needed capacity. And especially in times where extremes become more extreme, you need water in the river when there's a drought. So a natural environment is of necessity. you need to have enough room for the river when there is a flood or at least a large rain event and meltwater. Room for the River turned out to be a program embedded in a law. And in that law, it said, and I think that is also important, two principles. One was safety, which was really addressing the question of how do we deal with the water. But the other as important a principle in the law was quality. Quality of the environment, taking into account environmental issues, quality of space for a healthy environment for people, quality to add value, so not profit, but value, and quality of the process. So Room for the River became a program where we started to work together with every citizen along those rivers, trying to figure out what we could do together to ensure that those rivers were fit for the future. In the end, we implemented 39 projects. Over close to 2.5 billion euros were invested in our riverine system. And with such a massive infrastructure investment across so many of the communities, we only had one court case. Why? Because the first 5 years did not went into engineering, but into collaboration, partnerships, understanding, awareness. I think that is the critical part too. You have to look at the future, be provocative, sustainable, resilient in building back, but you have to do it together, leaving no one behind. And in the Netherlands, it's different than in Bangladesh, but it works in the same way. Making sure that every voice is heard at that table, indigenous, most marginalized first, is not only good for the process, it's amazing for the projects because you inform results that really stick and really add value to all. So it's a little bit how Room for the River can also inspire working across the world in disaster prevention, disaster risk reduction, and disaster response.
Hank, thank you very much. And I think beyond the immediate inspiration one can take from the Room for the River project, I think we're really up to something here, perhaps not only in terms of what we need, but also in terms that it turns out like working with nature, but also with the people concerned, however we have changed the nature with climate change, might also be something that makes the financing easier or perhaps at least less costly, more successful at the end. But I would like to move a little bit towards one specific, the specific topic of inequality, which I already alluded to in my introduction. When I saw from the train window last July, all these houses that were poor people's houses very, very clearly. And Alana earlier had the figures on how much disaster impacts piles up onto poverty, makes poor people even poorer. And at the same time, disaster deepens even further the gap between the poor and the rich. And that was true for the flooding, and we've seen it again with COVID-19 over the last years. So financing into resilience is a crucial social policy tool also. So the question is how to use financing disaster resilience to ensure no one is left behind, as you just said, Henk, and also what are the ethical principles of investment that is needed to ensure disaster resilience? And Alana, you had the figures earlier, and I guess the focus of the World Bank is very much into integrating DRR broadly into public infrastructure everywhere. So my question is a bit double. How much a role do these inequalities play in the World Bank's DRR investment decisions? You already mentioned this a little bit earlier, but perhaps you can develop further on it. But also, how receptive are the people you meet? How easy is it to convince them?
Sure, thank you. So, I mean, I think inequalities are huge and are magnified in every disaster, unfortunately. You know, if you're already on $1 a day and you lose $1 in a disaster, that's a lot more impactful than if you were earning $100 a day. So every dollar makes a difference depending on the income that you have. And so poor people, even if we lose exactly the same dollar, the impact on a poor person is so much higher. And I think that's intuitive, but sometimes we just don't have the numbers. And we see, for example, here in Romania, that there's Bucharest and then there's the rest of the country. It's almost like a tale of two cities. And so how disasters play out are very, very different. And so we actually wanted to look at the numbers on that and see what it actually meant. But traditionally in disaster risk management, and we learned this from the insurance industry, the way we assess risk is to look at asset value. And if you look at asset value and you want to prioritize your resources to the area where your asset loss is going to be the highest, which is what you do in insurance, of course, that's the wealthier area. So you inadvertently are missing the poorer areas because they have, in terms of an absolute wealth number, much less to lose. So this is something we've learned and we've thought about. And so rather than, for example, when we developed a program to rehabilitate and reconstruct very vulnerable schools in Romania, we looked at, of course, the engineering vulnerability and the number of students that they serve, but we also looked at economic inequality, and we made those rankings equal. So we're looking at vulnerable schools in areas with higher economic inequality and higher numbers of exclusion and poor educational performance. So it's trying to come at two objectives, or three actually, if you consider socioeconomic equality, educational performance, as well as DRM under the same program. So it is really important. And we've also learned a lot about making sure that people have access to formal banking, insurance, identity is really important. Without identification, you often cannot access social protection programs after a disaster. Without formal banking, all of your assets are with you. You have nowhere else to put your assets. So there's a lot of work that we do of looking at how to help more vulnerable people, because we know that in a disaster, it doesn't matter if you're in Zimbabwe or in Croatia or in Greece, disasters are going to push people into consumption poverty. And that can be long lasting and really increase inequalities. So very important message.
Alana, thank you so much. Veronique, I think the Barnier Fund also tries to leave no one behind. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly. It is a very important point for us and for the Fonds Barnier. And it is very critical to ensure that resilience to natural hazards is integrated into social policies. And we need to combine approaches because a number of persons accumulate several liabilities. For example, those who live in thermal flats are also the same people who live in disaster areas from which they cannot afford to live. So, for example, quite recently, the subsidy level of the Fonds Barnier has been upgraded to reach 80% of the amount the people need for resilience for their buildings. I think it's quite important. And beyond this example, I think we must collectively make progress on the integration of low-income population into our system. Just one example, France is co-leading an Interreg program supported by European funds entitled Building Resilience in Flood Disadvantaged Communities, called BRIC. And the aim of this research project is to improve the resilience of territories in the context of climate change, with a focus on the most disadvantaged people, those who are furthest from the labor market or aging also. So the aim of this action is to trigger new vision, behavior, and adaptation of the populations so that they are more resilient to the effects of climate change, and particularly in terms of flooding. That's what I wanted to underline.
Veronique, thank you so much. Dragos earlier in his speech said one thing: a natural disaster can reveal a social disaster. but the real disaster is when we lose hope. So I would like to spin this a little bit further with the minister. Earlier this year, Eurobarometer released a survey that showed that for a vast majority of Europeans, the EU should really be strong on fighting poverty and social inequalities. And in Portugal, this was said by more than 3/4 of the respondents. That is more than anywhere else in the European Union. So one can at least deduct that there is quite a backing for social investment in the Portuguese population. So, Minister, my question would be, how concretely do you bring these two together, fighting inequalities and steering financial decisions towards more resilience against disaster?
Muito obrigado por esta questão bem pertinente. Respondo dizendo da forma como nós apresentamos o nosso programa de recuperação e resiliência. Conforme eu já tive a oportunidade de dizer, nós temos os recursos centrados nos dois grandes desafios, nos desafios gêmeos da transição climática e da transição digital. Eles correspondem à agenda que é nossa, que é também europeia, e que naturalmente corresponde às principais prioridades onde assenta o processo de recuperação europeia. Mas também juntamos um terceiro eixo, que nós chamamos mais especificamente de resiliência, que é precisamente para responder à nossa situação, e a situação que corresponde à necessidade de incluir respostas no domínio social daquilo que a própria pandemia veio a revelar como carente de respostas e que veio agravar os efeitos da crise sanitária. Estou aqui a falar de uma dimensão que abrange 10 mil milhões de euros de investimento nos próximos anos, dos 17 mil milhões de euros que representam o nosso programa total de recuperação e de resiliência. Portanto, ele é claramente maioritário relativamente às outras duas dimensões da transição climática e digital, entendidas no seu sentido mais restrito. E o que é que estamos aqui a falar? Estamos aqui a falar em investimentos muito robustos nas áreas sociais que mostraram-se menos resilientes ou carentes de investimento para terem uma resposta mais resiliente. Estou a falar do nosso Serviço Nacional de Saúde, onde vamos investir sobretudo nas redes que estão mais no contacto direto com os seus utilizadores, a rede de cuidados primários, a rede de cuidados paliativos, portanto, as redes que estão em contacto mais direto com os utilizadores, um investimento fortíssimo também na habitação, portanto, a habitação das pessoas mais vulneráveis, investimentos também nos equipamentos sociais, de apoio a idosos, de apoio a crianças, e também um programa muito especial de combate a bolsas de pobreza em áreas metropolitanas, nomeadamente nas regiões de Lisboa e do Porto. Mas para além desta questão social mais direta, nós também entendemos que a resiliência também se joga em duas dimensões. Na resiliência dos territórios, através de programas onde temos incluídos as infraestruturas, um programa de infraestruturas de diversas naturezas, o tal programa que eu falei ainda há bocado, destinado às florestas, um programa muito virado para a mudança do perfil florestal, para a mudança da estrutura de propriedade e também uma terceira dimensão, um programa da gestão da água nos territórios. Todo este conjunto de investimentos, para nós, são investimentos de natureza social e ligados à melhoria da nossa resiliência. E que são complementares e que vão permitir, certamente, que nós façamos acompanhar os efeitos puros e duros da transição climática e digital de investimentos que permitam mitigar e responder aquilo que todos nós desejamos e que, debaixo do lema de não deixar ficar ninguém para trás nestes processos de mudança estrutural. Portanto, respondendo à sua questão, sim, existem problemas que não decorreram só da pandemia, eram problemas que em Portugal já existiam, estruturais, anteriores à pandemia, agravaram-se com a pandemia, vieram até mais ao de cima, mais a nu com a pandemia, e portanto, nós agora priorizamos algumas das áreas como áreas igualmente prioritárias que, a par de melhoria do perfil económico das empresas e da economia, darão uma resposta mais integrada, mais sistémica àquilo que é a resposta para a saída da crise.
Minister, thank you very much, and a very, very good reminder that it's not only about the resilience of the territory, but it's much more complex and vaster. Now, I'm pushing the debate a little bit further. I just learned, Hank, that you have to leave in a few minutes for another very important meeting. So I will take the opportunity for a last but a little bit complex question, because there's several aspects in it. But may I ask you to connect the dots on how may I call the Room for the River a nature-based solution? How such a program ties into the discussion, into the fight against inequalities, and perhaps also on how the whole focus on water as a connecting element of many questions plays out in the fight against inequalities. And on top of that, I would ask you to explain perhaps a little bit, how do you build the business case for DRR finance against the backdrop of these programs? Hank, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Olaf. The $1 million question. Room for the River is partially nature-based because we focus on the natural system. Not every part of the implementation, of course, is soft. It is a combination of urban development in and along our rivers, making more room, creating opportunities for wetland restoration of the outer banks of these rivers, and increasing natural value. That is one. How does that link to inequality? Well, in the Netherlands, it's of course a different case than when we go to places where we really have the most marginalized, at the forefront of climate risks. But here it was really about inclusion first. The quality of the process drove the solutions to ensure that everybody was involved, leaving no one behind. I work around the world, I actually don't work in the Netherlands anymore, but only in other places around the world. And that leaving no one behind really has to have a real meaning. It's easily said, hard done. And the way we use water as a we call it the leverage, as a real springboard to catalyze climate action and sustainable development, also is a way to bring people together. Water, Ban Ki-moon said water is life because it is about everything and everyone. Everybody has a stake. So if you organize a process where you have the capacity to bring people from all these different backgrounds together, across their interests, across vested interests, across sectors and silos, how we create it in our society, but also across most marginalized and less vulnerable to least vulnerable. You create the opportunity to understand the different values of water that can bring to these solutions the added value you need. And that means there is something in it for everyone. So this value-based, societal value-based approach is not only about preventing losses, which is one for insurers, assurers, and financiers. It's also about creating added value. Multifunctional, multidimensional, across the Sustainable Development Goals approach means that it's not about preventing a flood. No, it's creating a healthy city or a healthy environment. And when you start to do that, the business case is easy. But the moment you say, hey, I want to build a barrier, you only focus on, again, looking at the past and preventing such a thing to happen again. But if you say, hey, I want, along the lines of the 2030 agenda, all these SDGs and the Paris Agreement, say, I want to prepare myself for that future and invest in that future, there is a business case of all these added values. And one example comes from Chennai in India, but I can name many, so it's very hard. But we're working in this city from the ground up with a grassroots approach, local communities, with local, regional, and national governments, with international financing partners, with international experts. So we bring the talent of these communities together with the talent of the world, you could say, and develop solutions nature-based that restore historic tanks, build new temple tanks, restore wetlands, create bioswales, revitalize the canals and the rivers. So a healthy environment starts to tick the many boxes of the SDGs. And funny enough, which of course is amazing, a third less of investment than in hard infrastructure to prevent losses, and half of the cost in maintenance and operations, and 80% of carbon reduction. So the case for resiliency is both mitigating risk and mitigating climate change, building a solid business case, creating healthy environment. And this starts from the ground up. And the push here is, how can you bring this to scale? How can we replicate? And this would be my last thing. The Climate Change and Land report of the IPCC from 2019 clearly shows that the majority of our investment is increasing climate change, and the way how we invest is increasing our vulnerability. So we have to reverse course on that investment. In the 1 or 2% of the investments, like I showed in Chennai, but there are many more examples around the world, where we can actually develop a sustainable future, build more resiliency for our communities, and create a value add also for the economy, for jobs, and reducing inequality. We have to find ways to scale that. The 1% should be the mainstream. At COP, I said it's only 4 steps, from 1 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 16, and 16 becomes the majority. It's easy. 4 steps for mankind. We can do it in the next decade, I would say, until 2030, making sure that those projects and approaches, the process of inclusion, the process of innovation, the process of sustainability, future-proof, and the process of comprehensiveness, holistic, becomes the mainstream attitude to risks, but also to opportunities. I'm pretty sure we are able. I'm also pretty sure we're willing. So we're here, at least. So we look forward to scale this. We look forward to bring this to COP27 in Egypt, Sharm el-Sheikh, then to the UN 2023 Water Conference, the second ever in the history of the UN, and then to the Emirates COP. I think in the next 2 years, we will see a shift in how we do this right. I want to thank all. I'm very sorry, but I have to run. I'm 4 minutes late. My calendar is a little bit of a mix-up today, but thanks so much for this relevant and interesting debate, and hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for granting us 4 more minutes of your agenda. And I hope you enjoyed the debate. I hope you will have another successful meeting afterwards. And as we are also, all of us, coming closer to the finish line, I want to push the debate a bit further on the actual topic of purely financing. And when it comes to the costs and the impact of disasters, we don't always have the numbers, and we don't always have the figures for the impact of disasters. But even beyond that, Alana, I'll be asking a bit of a question. It's perhaps a vain hope, but does an institution like the World Bank has figured out how much money is actually needed? Do we have any idea of how much investment is needed to make Europe resilient for the next, well, years, couple of decades, let's say?
That's a very good question. So no, we don't have the numbers, so to speak, but we do know, I guess, some valuable pieces of information about it. So, for example, if you look at what it takes to make critical infrastructure resilient, transport, energy, water systems, and if you look at all of the needs across the entire world, the numbers are enormous. But actually, if you do a bit more analysis and say, where are the critical pieces of the puzzle? What is the bridge that we absolutely need to keep functional to keep the traffic going? What is the main energy aspect, the high voltage lines that we need to keep going? So rather than look at all infrastructure on everything, prioritize to the critical points of infrastructure. Look at where there's no redundancy. So if you do that, you can actually prioritize, and the amount of financing that's needed is much, much smaller. So you try and invest everywhere on everything, it's too much. But you can prioritize and really look at areas where there's either criticality or there's no redundancy. Sometimes that's the same, sometimes it's different. And so I think that is one aspect to it. But I really also want to build on what Henk said, is that if you just look at financing for resilience with just like that lens, you miss the picture. So what you need to look at it as more holistically, because convincing people to invest on a hypothetical disaster, and that's how many people see disasters. You can't tell me what date, how many people will be affected, the exact location. So it stays in the realm of hypothetical compared to an exact need that you have now. So how to convince people to invest in a hypothetical disaster that could happen in 10 years or 20 years is very difficult. But instead, if you focus on the immediate benefits that can be realized now for society, irrespective if no disaster happens. So, for example, when you look at how extreme heat is growing in cities across Europe, and you get these urban heat island effects. Well, one of the best ways to combat urban heat island effects is to plant more trees, increase the number of waterways, more cycleways. So that translates to less pollution, better air quality, nicer parks. Who doesn't want to live in a city that looks like that? But at the same time, those parks can have rainwater come in during flood, can help during drought. So there's many benefits in a city. It's the same as I mentioned before with respect to assets. If you just come in and say it needs to be disaster resilient because of a disaster that could happen from 10 years, you're not going to get an entry point. If you say the building is outdated, doesn't meet modern needs, it doesn't have enough bathrooms for females, it doesn't have disability access, it doesn't service the population that it should. Oh, and by the way, it's also highly vulnerable in disasters, then you can sell it. And I think looking at those holistic approaches actually does make a difference. And that also makes it scalable. And the financing goes much, much further. So,
Elena, thank you very much. And I think that is, we're coming to very concrete ideas, I think, for how to build the business case for investing in DRR. And I think it is crucial indeed what you just mentioned to highlight always the immediate benefits. And that is, I guess if I frame and phrase that a little bit in terms of building back better, that is building back better not only for the future, but building back better for the immediate past, for the immediate present. And we are now starting to run short of time. So I would ask everybody to answer shortly, even if I ask complex and long questions still. But there's one question, Minister, which I would really like to ask you still. As you are in government function, and currently many argue that in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis, the state is back because there's big investment, of course, there's big investment also, as Dragos earlier mentioned from the EU side. So my question would be, should we go for a sort of, well, the Americans would probably call it big state solution, that is establishing a regulatory framework with clear rules for such and such investment. This and that percentage needs to be reserved for disaster risk reduction. Or what other solutions come to mind when it comes to incentivizing investment in disaster risk reduction? Minister.
Pensamos que em situações mais complexas, onde o conjunto de condicionantes e a tal incerteza aumenta, o papel do Estado sai mais convocado, no sentido de que ele é chamado a maiores responsabilidades. No entanto, enfim, este papel do Estado tem diversas dimensões. Desde logo, julgo que tem de fazer o seu papel principal e, neste novo contexto, encontrar um novo mix de como fazer funcionar a economia de mercado. Não é apenas a substituição clássica do conceito de falhas de mercado e substituir as falhas de mercado pela intervenção do Estado. Não sei se me estou a fazer entender. Portanto, no modelo clássico, quando o Estado justificava a sua ação, quando o mercado não funcionava, entrava o Estado a funcionar. Eu acho que neste contexto, aquilo que se pede ao Estado é para repensar todo o contexto, no sentido de encontrar um novo mix, que eu acho que requer novas soluções mais criativas, nomeadamente de cooperação entre o público o privado e no público, entre o público central, o público local e o público regional. Portanto, julgo que todos temos de ser convocados para, em primeiro lugar, identificar necessidades, identificar soluções e encontrar financiamento. Todos. Numa primeira fase, o Estado tem uma responsabilidade fundamental, que é conseguir montar este processo e dinamizar este processo. Eu acho que a dimensão e a complexidade que estamos a falar não dispensa um processo deste tipo. Não é possível. Face aos valores que nós devemos estar em cima da mesa, das necessidades de investimento, que eu próprio acho que carecem de confirmação. O contexto é tão difícil que com diversas tecnologias, custos de energia, custos de matérias-primas, a mudarem de uma forma perfeitamente errática e não controlada. Eu não percebo como é que é possível, neste momento, nós quantificarmos com alguma certeza, com o mínimo de certeza, as necessidades de investimento. Portanto, isto requer uma cooperação entre o privado e o público, certamente muito, muito perto. Portanto, é o que eu acho, que depois, sobretudo na área do financiamento, nós temos de ter aqui uma outra atitude. Na questão do financiamento dos efeitos dos desastres naturais, que vão ser de maior dimensão, vão ser de maior frequência, nós temos de encontrar aqui outro tipo de solução, que não passa apenas pelo financiamento do público. Nós temos o setor financeiro, o setor segurador, que não pode limitar-se à sua tradicional postura de vender seguros e cobrar prémios, e depois, na altura de se passar os eventos, de minimizar a sua participação no pagamento das indemnizações. Portanto, temos de encontrar aqui uma outra solução prévia de concertação de soluções de Estado e, neste caso, privado, por exemplo, desenvolvendo outro tipo de cooperações que eu sei que em muitos países estão a ser estudados e estão a ser montados.
Thank you very much, Minister. And I would have loved to end this with a short round of assessments, just ideas and takeaways for incentivizing into DRR finance. But we're already hit the time limit. We're already over time. So I will keep it very short. And I would really, really like to thank the remaining speakers. That is Minister de Sousa from Portugal, Veronique from France, and Alana from the World Bank for your participation in this debate on financing long-term resilience. And I think we dwelled on the huge task that is ahead of us again and again. This really has not to be underestimated. But I think there were a huge quantity of ideas how this can be done, and just things that come to my mind is of course the holistic approach Alana mentioned in several times, and this is of course to work with the people, get the people, the concerned people on board, leave nobody behind. And perhaps I resume it in these two slogans, well, basically building back better and leaving nobody behind. Because and of course the nature-based solution. Well, if I think about this, there's so much that comes to mind. So really, I think there is a lot to be done, and I say thank you very much to everybody. Keep up the good work, because this is a huge task that lies ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.